Just under a week ago, Scott Cawthon took the FNaF community by storm when he made a statement on the canonicity of the FNaF books. Someone took to Reddit with a fake email where Scott Cawthon supposedly confirmed that the Stitch Wraith stories and the Fright stories connected to it, along with all the Tales from the Pizzaplex stories, were entirely in the game's continuity. This was of course fake, and when this appeared on Reddit, many people pinged Scott asking if it was real, to which Scott responded with this. Quote, "I'm not sure if the email itself was faked, or if someone posing as me sent it, but anyone who knows me after all these years should know that this isn't how I would address such a serious topic. So let me take this opportunity to be as clear as possible. Concerning what people are saying about the canonicity of the books, yes, that is correct. I hope that clears everything up. Everyone have a great weekend." End quote. This statement understandably caught everyone's interest, but it has sparked yet another debate about what exactly he was referring to, which is funny because Scott says he hopes it clears things up, but in reality it just made people more confused. The question is though, was he just trolling us? The question in reality is really, when Scott says concerning what people are saying about the canonicity of the books, was he referring to what the fake email said, or was he referring to the general debate? In the case that it is the former, this would absolutely be able to be taken as confirmation, as he would be saying that Stitchline games and Tales games, the theories described in the fake email, are correct. But if the latter is true, this would not be confirmation, as he would just be saying that one of the answers is correct. Kind of like the Mangle's gender thing from years ago, where he was constantly asked what Mangle's gender is, and he said yes. The difference here is that Mangle's gender doesn't really affect the lore that much, even if it can lead to speculation and theories, but those theories don't have any large impact on the series. But the canonicity of the novella-length stories really does have a large impact, and so Scott saying that the answer is yes is very easy to misunderstand. It's entirely possible that Scott is trying to say that the books are in continuity, but the way that he's saying it, whether it's what he means or not, makes it very difficult to tell what it is intended to be. But on the other hand, even if these theories are true, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is meant to be him confirming it, even if it doesn't mean he isn't either. It's really hard to tell. The day all this happened, I ended up streaming Resident Evil 2 Remake, but before I started playing, I knew I should briefly discuss the whole thing so nobody would hassle me throughout the stream while I was playing something that had nothing to do with FNaF. Of course, people still did hassle me about it, but this is what I said at the beginning. And I know everybody's gonna try to bring it up in chat. Rainbow Entity already did. Sandwich Man, you did. I already knew you guys would, so I was like, I should talk about it at the beginning of the stream, and so I am. Everybody is taking it as confirmation. I don't think it's confirmation at all. I think it's just another Mangle's gender thing. I think it's the same thing. I think he's just saying which interpretation is correct. One of them for sure. That's what I think. That's how I interpreted it. I don't think it's really confirmation of anything. Scott's like the Riddler, literally. Alright, well, Resident Evil 2. At the time, I was pretty confident that it wasn't meant to be confirmation, but as I thought about it more, I was less certain, and at the moment, I'm still not certain. But whether Scott intended for this to be confirmation or not, which would be a bit out of character, but not out of the question considering how heated this debate can get, we can't really take it as definitive confirmation, just because we don't know for sure that it was meant to be. I think the wording in the context can seem to indicate that he did mean it as confirmation, but again, this is Scott we're talking about. He's always vague about this kind of stuff, and even if he didn't mean to be vague this time, he still kinda was. But to really figure out whether or not the books are in the game's continuity, we should go back to his original statements and find any other evidence there is for these books being in the games. I have made videos about the canonicity before, but now seems like as good a time as any to discuss it again in a single video. Obviously, I'll be going over some of the same points and saying some of the same things. Probably the most common reason people don't believe the Frights and/or Tales stories are in the game timeline is because Scott has supposedly always said the books are in a different continuity, but that's simply not true. Scott never said that. He claimed the novel trilogy was a different timeline, but regarding both Frights and Tales, he said the complete opposite, never claiming either of them to be a separate universe and more so implying that they're the same universe. Scott actually said that the Frights books would be looking to the past to fill in gaps and answer questions that the community had been having over the past year at the time. In Frights, we ended up getting some stories that perfectly landed with the games, like Ultimate Custom Night and Sister Location with the Mana Room 1280 and Room for One More respectively. But then we also got stories like What We Found, which was very heavily based around FNaF 3, but also does not fit the continuity of 3 at all, meaning it cannot take place within the game's continuity. But if we go back to what Scott originally said about the Frights books, he claimed that some stories would be directly connected to the games and some wouldn't. Now, what what directly connected means has been debated, but I personally feel that the simplest and most logical answer is that some stories simply take place in the game's timeline, like Room for One More, and some don't, like What We Found. This also lines up with Andrew, as Scott claimed the stories would answer questions from what at the time was the past year, and he says that right after Ultimate Custom Night, which appears in a Fright story and explains that it is a nightmarish torture inflicted on Afton by Andrew, which indicates that Andrew is the one you should not have killed rather than Cassidy, which ties him more with the game's timeline. I think Room for One More is one of the most direct connections with the games, as in it, Stanley works at Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rental, the underground facility from Sister Location, and his job is to ensure nothing gets out, and he also constantly hears banging throughout the story. This directly follows the events of Sister Location, as making sure nothing gets out alludes to the fact that Ennard has already escaped, and Stanley has to make sure that nothing else does. The banging he constantly hears can also be heard in Sister Location when we return from the Circus Gallery control module on night 1. The epilogues also directly follow the events of FNaF 6. The books have very direct connections. When we look at what Scott said about Tails, we can find that he himself didn't ever say anything directly to us, but the original description claimed the books to be in the world of the newest games. What this means has also been debated, as the world doesn't necessarily mean the timeline, but given that Fazbear Frights had direct connections, I feel like once again the simplest and most sensical answer is that they are in the game's timeline. However, this description for Tails was changed to Uncharted Corners, and so someone reached out to Scholastic asking if the original description still applies, to which they said that it does. Now, many people don't trust the word of Scholastic because they're obviously not Scott, but what people fail to realize is that Scholastic was following orders from Scott. Scholastic has responded to emails that asked about the contents of promotional material, and their response basically said that all promotional material, like advertisements or descriptions for the books, were instructed and provided by Scott, meaning he was the one that told them to say this about the Tales books. Now, yes, the phrase does not technically have to mean that it's the same continuity as the games, but it is very much implied, and the contents of the stories themselves further this point greatly. The Tales books, like Fright's, have very direct connections, but even more so than Fright's does. Especially now with Help Wanted 2, it's pretty clear that Glitch Trap is the Mimic program. The Mimic's appearance in Ruin being underneath the pizza place, having white eyes that glow orange, a similar design to how he's described in the books and hiding in costumes, and using a radio to mimic someone's voice to lure people to him so that he could kill them by ripping off their limbs and heads, as he seems to do in his jump scare, matches the ones from the books to a T, to the point where if it's really just a parallel, what was the point of making it match so perfectly? But outside of the animatronic just being under the Pizzaplex, the Mimic program in the Storyteller infects the whole Pizzaplex, altering the animatronic's behavior, essentially acting as a less advanced version of Glitch Trap. He's brought into the Pizzaplex through the Storyteller's tree, a baobab tree which lies in the middle of the Pizzaplex near the castle walls of the Pizzaplex Theater. Now, if we move over to Princess Quest, the door to Glitch Trap and later the door we open with the graves in Princess Quest 4 has a tree and castle walls, very clearly telling us that some version of Glitch Trap entered the Pizzaplex through a tree near castle walls, which not only indicates that Mimic is Glitch Trap, but also that he was brought into the Pizzaplex in the exact same way in the games as he was in the books. We also know that the more evolved Mimic, the actual Glitch Trap virus, was also brought into the Pizzaplex by Gregory, as seen in GGY, who also wins the top score on Pizzaplex arcades along with another user, Axel aka ABC, who earns pretty high scores but way lower than GGY's scores. Now, if we move over to Security Breach, we learn that Gregory has brought the Glitch Trap virus to the Pizzaplex, which, if Tails was in the games, would have overtaken the Storyteller Mimic and even further amplified the animatronic's behavior. GGY is also the top scorer on many arcades, and some even have ABC on them. It's exactly the same in both. Bobby Dots Part 1 also has a few things that perfectly match what we see in Security Breach, like DJ Music Man going haywire because of his glitchy bouncer mode, and reaching into the bathroom and crawling through tubes in the walls, all match, and so do the generators being in the daycare and the play structures, and the Phaser Blast hieroglyphic looking wall textures. I've even been told that the original leaked version of Bobby Dots Part 1 had the alien staff bots from Security Breach be described inaccurately, but in the final version of the book, the description of them was changed to match the games more. And there's many other examples too of things being basically one-to-one with the games. Why would they go through so much effort to have Tales from the Pizzaplex match the games one-to-one if they're not meant to be the same? What's the point of having everything be exactly the same in both the games and the books if they're not meant to be one and the same? So, is that the answer? Was what the fake Scott email said about the books correct? Is the stitch line in the game's continuity? Many people would say yes, and I could see it going either way, but I personally don't think it's that simple. I've discussed this before, but I personally believe a theory called split line games, which if you ask me is a pretty stupid name for a theory, but I didn't come up with it. The theory is basically stitch line games, but that FNaF 6 was a breaking off point, splitting the timeline into two different directions, one leading to the Stitch Wraith stories and one leading to the Pizzaplex era. This is probably the least recognized and believed of the 4 main theories regarding the book's canon, those being Stitchline games, Splitline games, only Tales games, and just none of the books being in the game's continuity. One of the biggest reasons for that is just that there doesn't really seem to be any reason that Scott would split the timeline, but I actually think I have a pretty good explanation as to why that would have happened, and I'm honestly pretty satisfied with it. But what exactly supports the theory? Well, the Stitch Right stories directly follow the events of FNaF 6, and like I said before, Room for One More matches sister location very well. Scott also did say that some storylines would be directly connected to the games and some wouldn't, so any stories connected to the Stitch line that take place before FNaF 6 would be directly connected to the games, like, as I've been saying, Room for One More, which seems to be connected to the Stitch line via the Snack Space connection, and the Snack Space also appears in Security Breach, along with arcade machines of characters like Ralpho, the Plush Trap Chaser, and Fetch from Fazbear Frights, which connects those characters to the games and indicates they exist in the game timeline. So I feel like the Stitch line being directly connected to the games is definitely true, but the stories taking place after FNaF 6 would not be in the game's timeline, but rather branching off from it, which would still mean that they are directly connected, with the earlier ones still taking place within the actual game's timeline and also being directly connected. Frailty from Tales from the Pizzaplex heavily implies that Eleanor exists in the same universe as Tales, which is the games, which does connect Fazbear Frights to the games. And so does Lally's game, as Eleanor seems to appear at the end of it, peering over the box in the attic, which perfectly matches the attic with the box in the final Frights epilogue, which Eleanor appears inside. The problem with that, though, is that Eleanor was already gone by that point in the timeline, and Lally's game takes place after the Pizzaplex shut down, which, if Stitchline games were to be true, would be long after Eleanor was already gone, and long after this epilogue even happens. That means that the memory of Lally's game cannot be here, but somehow it is. What this indicates to me is that the story is trying to indicate that Lally's game was Eleanor's doing, it just wasn't this version of Eleanor. Another issue comes from the Mimic's placement in the timeline. The Mimic story has to take place between 1983 and 1985, as Edwin is making Freddy's animatronics for Fazbear Entertainment, and that's the span the first Freddy's was open, and the animatronics are made of fabric so they can't be the toys. The Mimic is also 40 years before the Storyteller, which has to be in 2023 or later since it's after FNaF 6. In Security Breach, the Faz Life magazines are said to be quarterly, meaning the Pizzaplex must have been open for just under 5 years by the time of Security Breach since there's 19 magazines. The calendar that can be found in Security Breach only matches a few specific years, including 2029, 2035, 2046, and a bunch more, obviously. However, if the Pizzaplex was open between 2023 and 2025, the only time Security Breach could have taken place is 2029, which leaves the Storyteller to take place in 2024, and the Mimic in 1984. However, FNaF 6 is in 2023, and the Pizzaplex opens in 2024, the very next year. Fazbear Entertainment had to have had really efficient workers to build that massive thing in under a year, or maybe even a couple months considering FNaF 6 seems to be closer to Halloween and the Pizzaplex is somehow built by December. Technically it is possible, as there was once an entire church built in like one day, so in a similarly paced scenario, a building on the scale of the Pizzaplex could be built in a couple months, but it would definitely be cutting it close. But the issue with this is not the time frame that the Pizzaplex was built in, but rather that it doesn't match with Fazbear Frights. Fazbear Frights and Tales from the Pizzaplex are connected by Frailty, but they're also separated by the Mimic. What it seems like to me is that Fazbear Entertainment instantly started building the Pizzaplex after FNaF 6 burned down, which does not match the timeline of the Frights epilogues because FNaF 6's fire is said to have been so far in the past it was almost ancient history, when if they happened before the Pizzaplex opened, that could just not be the case. Ancient history does not have to mean it's like 100 years, but this all happening before the Pizzaplex opens would place the epilogues at most around 6 months after FNaF 6. Which is not ancient or so far in the past at all. And even then, the Pizzaplex being built over the fire site would definitely have been mentioned in the Frights epilogues if that was happening. Basically, there's no time for the Frights epilogues to happen between FNaF 6 and the Pizzaplex era, especially since Fazbear Entertainment seems to have mostly died out after FNaF 6 in this timeline, especially with the nurses in the Manor Room 1280, which is most likely a decent while after FNaF 6 as well, being horrified at the thought of it. There is one workaround, which is that FNaF 3 and FNaF 6 simply happened in 2015 rather than 2023, which would still be cutting it close but would make it more plausible. The FNaF 3 description claims it to be 30 years after Freddy's opened, which could be interpreted as the first time it shut down in 1985, and 30 years after that is 2015. I could see that, though I think 2023 makes more sense as 1993 is the last time Freddy shut down. But I could definitely see FNaF 3 happening in 2015, especially since that's the year that the game was released, even though I do find it less likely than 2023. But I could not get behind simply ignoring HRY 223, which to me very clearly means Henry 2023, especially considering it perfectly matches with the 30 years after FNaF 1 thing as well, and that means that FNaF 6 has to be in 2023. What I think happened was that Fazbear Entertainment started work on building the Pizzaplex immediately after FNaF 6 burned down, which led to minimal police investigation into the fire, no puppet being retrieved, and no William going to the hospital. This then leads to Fazbear Entertainment using the Mimic for a bunch of different things, which then leads to the Pizzaplex era, with Fazbear making the FNaF VR game and later opening the Pizzaplex. But in the alternate timeline, Fazbear Entertainment does not build the Pizzaplex over the FNaF 6 location, which led to a much more thorough investigation, leading to them discovering the puppet and Afton's body, leading to the events of the Stitch Wraith timeline. In the game's timeline, those epilogues never happened, meaning Eleanor never died, which leaves her perfectly open to be around in Frailty, and possibly even later in Lally's game. Hell, Eleanor is the Shadow, which is very similar in nature to Shadow Freddy, and Shadow Freddy is Nightmare, and Nightmare in the Halloween DLC of FNaF 4 is replaced by Nightmarion, who has been constantly appearing in the Security Breach era, with the staff bots and her FNaF VR level, and especially the plushies, which are labeled as just the Nightmare plushies rather than Nightmarion, tying them more closely with the original character he represented, that being Nightmare, Shadow Freddy. This could be setting up Eleanor to be a villain in the game's timeline, keeping her backstory from the Fright's epilogues, but following her in a different storyline. But I've talked about this for a while, and some of you are probably wondering, why would Scott split the timeline? What purpose would that serve? Well, we have to remember that Ultimate Custom Night was originally meant to be the final game, and Fright's books began being written around 2017, before Ultimate Custom Night even came out. Of course, more games ended up coming out, but when it first came out, it was meant to be the last game, or at the very least, the last canon game, which we all know changed. What I think happened was that Fright was originally meant to follow the events of FNaF 6, taking place in the game's timeline and wrapping up the story completely, but something changed, and while writing Fazbear Frights, Scott decided to keep going with the story. I feel like he wanted to go in a different direction, so he made it instead that while the Frights books stayed as a sequel to FNaF 6, they were an alternate timeline that the story could have gone in, but didn't. At least not in the game timeline. It's basically like how in Loki, there's the sacred timeline, which is the main timeline, but if something different happens, a branch is created, keeping the sacred timeline the same, but creating a new timeline that branches off from the main one. The Stitch line is a branch, and the game's timeline is the sacred timeline, with the Stitch line only being one thing that could have happened in the games, if they went slightly differently after FNaF 6. But I don't know, there's always the possibility that Scott just didn't consider the dates properly, though I do think it's really easy to notice the big timeline issues of Stitchline games is true, but I mean, it is possible. I just personally feel that Splitline games is the idea that takes into consideration all of the evidence in a way that creates the least amount of holes. But maybe you guys disagree. Maybe you guys think that Stitchline games is true, which is totally valid, and so is believing none of the books are in the games. I'm just here to present you guys with the main evidence, not all of the evidence, as there are of course other sources people cite for these theories, like for instance the Ultimate Guide, but I've just brought up everything in this video that I think was the most necessary to bring up, and hopefully I've inspired some of you guys to create your own ideas and opinions on the timeline. At some point in the future, I plan to make a video solving how each different FNaF timeline connects together, going off this Loki sacred timeline idea, solving how each timeline comes from one sacred timeline, and also solving where each timeline could branch off, whether right at the beginning or right at the end, essentially solving every single different FNaF timeline, or at the very least trying to. At some point after that, I plan on doing what will probably be one of the biggest projects I've ever done. Honestly, actually, definitely one of the biggest projects I've ever done. Actually, no. The biggest project I've ever done. So big I don't even know if I'll be able to figure out how to make it, but I'm determined enough to make it that I'm sure that even if it takes like 10 years, I will do it. But assuming I manage to, which I probably and hopefully will, it'll most likely be my big FNaF 10-year anniversary project, but I won't spoil what the project will be or how it will work just yet, and you guys are welcome to speculate, but I won't confirm or deny anything if you guys try to guess. I'll talk more about what it is closer to the actual release date, but yeah, I really hope you guys enjoy this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, especially if you're interested in the projects that I have planned, and if you feel like it, maybe consider stopping by my Resident Evil 3 stream tomorrow. But I do know most of you guys are here for FNaF and aren't interested, and that's perfectly fine, but stop by if you want to. And to those of you who will be there, I'll see you tomorrow for that stream, but for the rest of you, I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys!